Thank you for the conference organizers for this great conference and for this opportunity to present my paper. The paper is with Sudarshan Jayarama, Shue Lin, and Joanna Wu, and I'm Yong Zhang. And in this paper, what we try to do is we try to offer a parsimonious approach to assess the efficiency of compensation contract. And oops, And obviously, assessing the efficiency of compensation contract is important in compensation research for a long time, but it's becoming increasingly more difficult, partly because the compensation contracts are becoming more complex. For example, the recent paper by Albuquerque et al. Shows that, okay, we have a lot of different aspects of the compensation contracts. For example, we have different types of compensation, salary, bonus, equity. We have different performance measures, stock returns, different versions of earnings, cash flow, level versus growth measures. We also got, measurement period, vesting conditions, performance targets, different relative performance evaluation, etc. Okay, and that makes the compensation contracts very difficult on a sort of overall sort of level. And also, in addition to this, for a long time, we have believed that, okay, at the end of the year, the compensation committee would basically take the compensation formula and they basically plug in the realized performance and then they calculate the compensation payout. And that is the dollar amount paid to the managers, etc. But that is really not the full picture, because recent evidence shows that, okay, even after the realized performance has come out at the end of year reported in the financial statements, the compensation committee, they still do substantial ex post adjustment to this realized performance. Right. And there are two papers by Na et al. And and Yang both in 2024, and they show that this sort of ex post adjustment by the compensation committee is very significant, it's highly discretionary and not transparent. And basically, one of the papers, they look at the compensation earnings, essentially the earnings numbers that are actually used in calculating the compensation payout. So the compensation committee take the reported accounting numbers, for example, the earnings, and then they would basically adjust that earnings numbers in arriving at the compensation earnings. Then they plug in the compensation earnings into the formulas to calculate compensation payout. And this paper showed that only 1% of the firm years have compensation earnings. That is exactly equal to GAAP earnings. And also compensation earnings, they deviate on average substantially from GAAP earnings. At the median is about 3%. Of the market value of equity, that's very substantial amount of deviation. And if we look at this example of McGraw-Hill 2009 proxy statement, I'm just highlighting this. So they basically say earnings per share is our performance measure, and we go to the annual reports, there is the reported earnings per share, but the compensation committee is going to make the adjustment at the discretion of the committee to exclude all or a portion of the positive or negative effects of the following earnings components. And then they list 6 items, number 1 through 5 are sort of normal earnings components. And then number 6, you see over here, is any other item of gain or loss as determined by the committee for the year. Right? So the compensation committee, you can see over here, has a lot of discretion in terms of making adjustment to ex post adjustment to this realized performance in terms of determining compensation payout. So because of these two features of the compensation contract, one is the complexity, the other is the ex post board discretion in adjustment. Both of these combined together would make it very difficult to assess the overall relation between pay and performance, and also make it probably even harder to compare it across firms between executives and over time. And in this paper, what we try to do is we try to sort of offer a parsimonious and comparable assessment of the efficiency of the compensation contract. So we basically develop a new measure of the CEO pay for performance sensitivity to potentially achieve that purpose. And to do that, we go back to the very traditional approach of assessing efficiency of compensation contracts. So we basically go to the original regression, regressing the compensation payout on the annual stock returns. But one thing we notice is that the annual stock return, it is traditionally treated as one performance measure, but it is really a combination of the stock returns of all the trading days during the year. Okay, and because you have all these different trading days during the year, and all kinds of information can arrive on these different trading days, and we are going to argue that the sort of differential kind of information arriving on different days would make these stock returns on different days to be not uniform in terms of being informing the board about the manager's effort. Okay, and we are going to argue that if we go back to the sort of classic compensation theory by Armstrong, a more efficient contract or more efficient board would likely try to tie compensation to the stock returns on days when the underlying events are more informative about manager effort. Okay, so basically what we try to do is we decompose annual stock returns based on the underlying corporate events for each trading day. So basically we sort of separate the annual stock returns from one performance measure into multiple performance measures, and they should have different properties in terms of determining compensation. And we do two steps of decomposition. One is that we would sort of classify corporate events into the ones that reflect managerial effort and ones that do not reflect managerial effort. Then among the ones that reflect managerial effort, we would further classify them into accounting-based versus not accounting-based. And we believe this distinction is important because the accounting system offers a certain amount of credibility to the information or the stock price or stock returns for two reasons. Number one is that accounting system offers certain verifiability sort of requirement for the information. And the number two is that the accounting numbers reported the subject to the certification of external audits, right? So both of these two features would add credibility to the information about accounting information essentially. And based on these two levels of decomposition of the events, we can basically decompose stock returns using two steps. One is that we decompose annual stock returns into return effort, basically return on the days on which you have corporate events reflecting managerial effort, and then you have correspondingly return non-effort, which is corporate events that do not reflect managerial effort, or on trading days, you do not have any corporate events. So that's the first decomposition. And then the second decomposition is basically to decompose return effort into accounting related versus not accounting related returns. And so we do the decomposition using the Capital IQ's key development database. We have got a list of corporate events from there, and then you can see that the accounting related events, the conference presentation costs, announcement of earnings costs, corporate guidance, meaning that the managers are forecasting future earnings, etc. And you have the corresponding frequency over here. And then we also have return effort, non-accounting, which are essentially other kind of major corporate events that are not accounting related, but they reflect managerial actions and effort nevertheless. And then lastly, we have a small number of corporate events that we believe that they do not really quite reflect the managerial effort. Number one, we have the executive and the board changes, and we believe that is probably due to the board's action instead of the managerial action. And then you have board meetings, end up of lockup period, ticker changes, fiscal year changes, etc. But the major one is the executive and the board changes. And then the regression is very simple. We basically, the traditional method, we regress the change in log compensation on the stock returns. And obviously, we decompose stock returns into different components. And in this regression, we control for industry and year fixed effects, and we control for the change in ROA, which is the reported accounting performance. And then other controls, we have sales squares for the size, control leverage, book to market, return and earnings volatility, loss, and the CEO tenure and the CEO age. And so we have the sort of descriptive stats for the different return components, and correspondingly, we also have the number of trading days associated with each sort of return components. And first, before we go to the regression on the compensation, we sort of try to verify our basic assumption that the return components are differentially associated with managerial effort. To do that, we sort of regress the future cash flow on the return components. And the first one you see is that the returns are annual stock returns are predictive of future cash flow, which is not surprising. But when you decompose that into non-effort versus effort portion, only the effort portion of the return is predicting future cash flow. And the difference, not only statistically significant, but the magnitude of the coefficient is very different. And then further, we decompose return effort into accounting versus non-accounting, and you can see that the predictive ability of the return is really concentrated in return effort accounting. And again, effect is pretty strong. And then we also sort of apply the same regression to the future 2 years, 3 years average cash flow, and the results are very similar. Now we have the baseline, so we basically regress the compensation on the return components. The first one, this we have seen many, many times in different compensation papers, right? So compensation, the higher is the return, the higher is the compensation. And then when we decompose it into return effort versus return non-effort, you can see that the return effort coefficient is much larger. It's about 74% larger than that the coefficient on return non-effort, and it's a significant difference. And similarly, the coefficient on return effort accounting is much larger than coefficient on return effort non-accounting. It's about 80% larger, right? So a very large portion of this sort of return ability to explain compensation comes from return effort accounting and then return effort, and less so in return non-effort. So that is consistent with the argument that these different return components are differentially informative about managerial effort. And one thing we want to do is we want to quickly show that our results are not really driven by common sort of compensation practice, such as relative performance evaluation. And what we do is we take sort of different definition of peer groups, including SIC2 industry, SIC2 industry size, and the Holberg and Phillips product market peer group, plus size and booked market. And the last one is evaluated market peers as peer groups. And then for each peer group, we either include the sort of peer group annual return, or we further decompose the peer group in return into different components following the previous decomposition method. And as you can see, our main results are very, very consistent across these different specifications of peer groups, and the coefficients are essentially the same across different specifications, and the coefficients are also very, very similar to our baseline regression without considering the relative performance evaluation. And the sort of message over here is that I think what we document over here is at least not driven by RPE, and most likely it's sort of a phenomenon that is orthogonal to the RPE sort of practice in compensation. And two other checks we did was we look at the cash versus equity, and the results hold for both of them, but it's stronger for equity because equity is more driven by stock returns. And then we also show that the results hold for both high and low CEO wealth groups. And after controlling wealth group, the results are the same. And the next thing we want to do is we want to show our results are stronger in cases when you have stronger shareholder alignment, and we use two settings. One is cross-listed firms, the other is institutional investor distraction. And in the cross-listed firms, the index is index for shareholder protection, right? The higher is shareholder protection, the better is the higher is the index. And you can see that when you have better sort of shareholder protection, the sort of compensation weight on return effort turns down, and the compensation sensitivity to return effort turns up, right? So that is consistent. This sort of pattern is strengthened when you have better shareholder protection, and the pattern is further strengthened if you look at the decomposition between return effort accounting versus non-accounting. And then we also show that, okay, we use the CANFAT or 2017 institutional investor distraction sort of measure. We show that this this pattern is weaker when the shareholders are distracted. Right? It's weaker when the shareholders are distracted. The coefficients between the two components, they're different. They are significantly different when the shareholders are not distracted. However, the two coefficients are insignificantly different from each other when the shareholders are distracted. And the similar results over the second step of decomposition. And then one of the sort of requirement of the previous analysis is that we are relying on Capital IQ's corporate events for the decomposition of the corporate events and the returns. And then we tried another method, not really requiring on corporate events sort of setting. Instead, we did a very, very simple decomposition. That is, we decompose the returns into return around earnings announcement versus return not around earnings announcement. For that, we have a much longer sample period from 93 to 2018. So that's essentially from the start of the executive comp. And the first column shows that the two return components that differentially predict future cash flow. And then the second column shows that the return EA is much more strongly associated with the compensation. And one of the important questions in accounting is whether or not there is a declining role of accounting information in CEO performance evaluation. And we show that if we do the sort of a regression each year, and then we take this long sample period, we break it down into early, middle, and late time period, you can see that indeed the red bar, which is the coefficient on change in ROA, the reported earnings numbers, that coefficient goes down, consistent with if you consider reported earnings as a relevance of accounting information, that does go down. However, if you look at the blue bar, which is the coefficient of return EA, that remains quite stable. However, you also have the coefficient of return on non-EA, that also goes down. Right? And also we look at the sort of the relation between stock return volatility and the pay for performance sensitivity. We have sort of two strands of literature, one of them arguing that, okay, when you have more volatility not driven by managerial actions, then the pay performance sensitivity should be lower. However, on the other side, if you have more volatility driven by changes in agents' actions, then the pay performance sensitivity should be higher, right? And what we predict is that the negative relation between stock return volatility and pay performance sensitivity should be less pronounced for the stock return components. That is more reflective of CEO effort, and the results are consistent, right? So higher volatility, less pay for performance sensitivity. However, this pattern is mostly concentrated in the return non-effort part because it's not reflecting managerial effort. And similarly, when we do the second step of decomposition, the results are similar. And the next, we do two validation of our sort of argument. One is that we show the CEO versus other executives, because CEO is the most important person and the stock return should be the most relevant signals for CEOs' effort, and we show all these patterns are amplified for the CEOs, okay, versus other executives. And then next, we show that our empirical patterns are stronger when the company's financial reporting quality is higher. Right? So basically, the first one measure we use for reporting quality is internal control weakness. So when you have internal control weakness, the financial reporting quality is lower, and correspondingly, this coefficient on return effort accounting is much smaller. And basically, when you have high reporting quality, then the coefficient difference between return effort, non-accounting versus accounting, the two coefficients are different from each other. However, when you have weak reporting quality, the two coefficients are not statistically different from each other. And the last one we show is that we also use an exogenous variation of the financial reporting quality, which is provided by the shock to the reporting quality by restatements of the auditor's other clients, right? So it's not the focal firm not having the restatements, but it's the auditor's other clients. And when they restate their earnings, they give a negative shock to the auditor's reputation, and correspondingly, they decrease the credibility of financial reporting of the focal firm, and the results are consistent, similar to the previous internal control results. Okay, and in summary, what we did was we distinguished between trading days based on the type of information arrival, and we offer methodology to assess the efficiency of executive compensation contracts. And we document substantial variation in terms of pay for performance sensitivity across these different return components. And these patterns are consistent with theoretical predictions, and they're not documented in prior literature, and they're not readily available from explicit or disclosed compensation contracts. And that's all I have. Thank you, and I look for your comments later.